Hello and welcome to this instalment of the Society for the Environment ENS Power List interview series. This series aims to celebrate the environmental achievements of environmental professionals and wants to draw attention to the ENS Power List, which was published earlier this year. So for our listeners, the ENS Power List is a list of the top 100 UK-based environmental professionals and features professionals from a wide range of sectors, from waste management to healthcare to ecology and more. So I'm Sophia Lisk, marketing and PR assistant for SocEnv, and today I will be interviewing Professor David Hill, who is the founder of the Environment Bank, chartered environmentalist, registered via the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, or CIEEM for short, and featured member of the ENS Power List. So firstly, a huge congrats for making it onto this list. What does it mean to you to be recognised and why?
Thank you, Sophia. Well, it's fantastic. I mean, it's rarely do these awards come along, I guess, and you sort of beaver away at your work and someone marvelous out there somewhere thinks that you might be worth getting one of these awards. So it's really good. And I think for certainly the last 30 or more years, I've been sort of an ecological professional and really keen on, improving the standard of ecology as a profession. And I think we've done that in spades, thanks to a whole range of organisations, not least the Society for the Environment and CIEEM. So really pleased to have received it. Quite shocked, probably, and humbled, but really good. Thank you.
Oh, that's amazing, and it's so nice to hear that they're recognising that. So you have a little bit already, but could you please just give an introduction into who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm David Hill. I'm a professional ecologist. I did a doctorate in population dynamics of birds a long time ago. And I worked for a variety of NGOs before I then set up one of the first environmental consultancies in the UK, which I sold to the RPS Group back in 2002. I then left RPS in 2006 and set up the Environment Bank. And the reason why was that I'd spent many years actually designing mitigation schemes for developments and realised that they really weren't providing value for biodiversity. Biodiversity was still pretty much ignored. So I just came up with the idea of biodiversity offsetting those impacts and then getting developments to generate gains for nature. So started in 2006, and Environment Bank, we bumbled along really with a few staff until last year when it went mandatory into law. So spent a lot of time lobbying government. I was deputy chair of Natural England as well until 2016, and did lots of lobbying of ministers and secretaries of state. I think 5 secretaries of state until we've got it mandated into law as being a requirement for developments to deliver a minimum of 10% gain. So that's really me. And since then, we've raised a lot of investment into the Environment Bank so that we can scale this up and create habitat banks, which I can talk about more later on, perhaps.
Wow, that's really impressive. You've done so much in a few years. So what do you most enjoy about your role?
Well, I guess my two big passions in life are wildlife conservation. I mean, from the age of 5, I guess, memory is starting to fade now, but from the age of 5, I was really interested in wildlife. Of course, there wasn't the word ecology then, and so I pursued through school biology. Obviously, you couldn't do ecology. Then did do a first degree in straight ecology, which was pretty remarkable back in the 1970s, and I'm just really passionate about wildlife conservation, always have been, and also wildlife photography. I just love doing that. So I like spending my time doing that. And perhaps in terms of the professional side of it, the biggest thing I think I've been trying to bang on about is getting private investment into private land holdings to deliver nature at scale. And that now I can see this is starting to happen really, big time. That makes me so proud and pleased, and lots of people now involved in it, which is great.
It's so nice to hear about people being proud of what they do. It's very nice to hear. And what would you say started your interest in the environment? So you said you always have been. Is it just something that came to you quite naturally, or was it something that maybe was introduced to you?
Well, it was probably my father who introduced me to sort of going for long walks in the countryside and knowing the birds and all the sort of local folklore names for birds. So I got really into, a bit nerdy into the birding side of things, I guess. And that stuck with me. And then I looked at how could I convert. I didn't really want to do a straightforward biology career progression. For me, that wasn't that exciting. So I tried to look at how I could make my interest in wildlife conservation, turn it into a career. And so started really early. And it's, every day you still see something new. I think what's really interesting about the profession as well is that it's also supported by a massive amateur base, many of whom are fantastic naturalists and field ecologists in their own right. And so there's not that many professions or industries where you get an amateur base and a professional base working together for the common good, if you like. And so that's fantastic. And there are always more people out there that know a lot more than one does about the subject, which is really interesting, I think.
That's great. And what are your future ambitions for the Environment Bank, if you can think of any?
Oh, well, I mean, it's just gone absolutely ballistic since fortunately, the mandating of the biodiversity net gain idea into law has escalated the interest in the Environment Bank beyond any measure. It's extraordinary. So just to give you a bit of a picture, we managed to raise an initial £200 million into the Environment Bank to create wildlife habitats, what we are calling habitat banks. And these are areas of between sort of 10 to 100 hectares or even maybe bigger than that. And we've gone from 4 staff back in May 2021 to 41 staff now, and just seeing that growth. And they're all beavering away, locking down land with landowners under habitat management plans to deliver, certainly in the initial phase, probably 4,000 to 5,000 hectares of new wildlife habitat. So that's converting arable farmland grade 3, grade 4 into new wildlife habitat. And then we think that once that's done, we'll be looking at the next investment tranche, which will be bigger than the 200 million. So we think that we can achieve huge things in the future, not just for the biodiversity net gain from development, but also for the corporate sector. Because if you imagine, just to major on this a bit, it's pretty clear that we've got 2 existential threats facing us. One's climate change and one's biodiversity loss. So we really have to address those. Everything else is relatively insignificant compared to those 2. And so I want to see the Environment Bank operating in the biodiversity loss restoration area at big scale. And so to do that, we just need lots of land, and we need lots of contractual arrangements with landowners and farmers. And we're starting to see that. So we've got around 600 landowners already registered with us. And we're scaling that, and we go in and we measure impacts, and we then bring in models to restore that land. And 55% of global productivity, global GDP, relies on what nature provides. And yet if you went to the FTSE 100 or FTSE 250 CEOs and asked them how they are measuring their impacts on nature and natural capital, it's only just starting. And that's going to scale big time, I think. And when that happens, we will then start to see a lot of investment put into biodiversity restoration. And that's the next thing that we're now majoring on, is how to look at that and deliver that, and underwrite all of the costs of creation and management. For many years, we underwrite that. And I think then you can really start to see nature recovery taking place in the UK. And of course, we want to do that globally.
Yeah, thank you. It's so exciting to see what the Environment Bank will achieve with all those new resources. So kind of moving on to you and how you've thrived professionally, why did you decide to become a chartered environmentalist?
Oh, that's a good question. I was really, back in the day, when it was, I'm talking probably the 1990s, and the Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management had, literally only just been set up. Can't remember when it was now, late 80s, early 90s. And I was one of the early members of the organisation, and we talked a lot about getting the chartered status so that it would raise the professional standing of ecologists, so that actually it was seen as a properly full-blown profession that many young people can come into, as they would in other sectors such as accountancy and teaching or whatever it might be. And we worked really hard, I think, back in that time to bring ourselves to get chartered status. So, and when we did, thanks to the hard work of many of the officers of CIEEM at the time, I was president of CIEEM for a while back then, but we had a fantastic group of officers that pushed forward for chartered status, got chartered status, and then it was pretty obvious that I must apply to become a chartered environmentalist. I was always a bit worried about the word environmentalist because it seemed a bit campaigning, but we couldn't think of anything better at the time, and it's certainly stuck. So that's where we are. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And what are you most proud of achieving over the course of your professional career?
Oh, crikey. I think the biodiversity net gain law has got to be that. Yeah, absolutely. There is no comparison. I've done quite a lot of really interesting things, I think. Well, interesting for me anyway. Certainly working on bird populations back in the day with the BTO and the RSPB and the Game Conservancy as it was then, all three really great organisations. But really for me, it was actually seeing that all the pretty grim stuff, I think, that was done or is still being done actually on mitigation schemes just to get planning developments permitted. To see that now we've got a much better way of doing biodiversity with development, and actually the developers are rising to that challenge. And so I don't think they see it as a burden. I think they see it as an opportunity, and that's what it is, because it's an opportunity to enable better economic growth based on a more sustainable footing. So I think I'm most proud of the biodiversity net gain idea, really. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'm definitely not surprised that you said that, hearing the difference before and afterwards. It's amazing. So have you been inspired or motivated by any other environmental professionals that you can think of?
Oh, crikey, yes, loads, I would think. Strangely, yeah. I mean, let me just try and think. There's so many. I mean, when I did my doctorate at Oxford, there were people there who, you thought, wow, fantastic, how to be amazing being in the same place as these people. My supervisor, Chris Perrins, was one. Undoubtedly, my mentor at the time was a fabulous person called Dr. Dick Potts, who pioneered huge amounts of research on agricultural systems in relation to farmland birds, and he was quite an extraordinary person, really. So I would certainly put him in there. And then one has to say David Attenborough, who I did manage to meet a couple of times in 2015 and had a good conversation with him. And he's just to say inspiring is to undervalue his phenomenal contribution in terms of communicating the importance of planet Earth to us, and why we've got to change our attitudes and behaviors very, very quickly. So he's such a remarkable person. So yeah, I would think those individuals, and there are many, many more, and I still see some of them now, that inspired me back in the day. Of course, you thought they were old then, but of course now I'm probably the age that they were. And so life goes on.
That's great that you've been surrounded by so many inspiring people, and I'm certainly very jealous that you've met David Attenborough. Especially for my generation, he's had such a great impact. So that's amazing. Do you have any examples of how you have maintained continuous professional development throughout your career? That might be a bit of a big question.
Well, yes, I probably haven't done it as formally as I ought to. So here's a lesson for anyone listening that, do record what you do. I've probably, I used to do it much more than I do now, to be honest. And I suspect maybe I'm becoming towards the end of my formal sort of full-time career. But record it as much as you can. I mean, things like taking part in really important workshops, particularly in the private sector, because that's what's really been exciting to me, is to try and tell the story about biodiversity conservation as it's not about a luxury. It's nice to have good biodiversity when we can afford it. It's absolutely fundamental. And I think I've been involved in a number of those things recently, particularly perhaps working with government, DEFRA, Treasury, and some very, very senior and important people around these, thinkers around this, which has changed the mindset of people in the last 10 years. We've got some incredibly good policy advocates within government. And I think probably I should have recorded those better than I have. And I'm sure that CIEEM will come back to me and say, can you submit your CPD form? And I have to do a bit of retrospective thinking based on my diary. But I do tend to do a lot of it, but maybe don't record it as much as I ought to.
Interesting. Yes, I think it's quite natural to probably record more of that when you're at the start of your career. But no, that's good advice. And are there any good practices that you started during lockdown that you have carried forward? Because obviously the pandemic changed a lot of practices and the way we work.
So that's a really good point. I absolutely have. And I'll let you into a secret. I mean, by February 2020, I was getting pretty frazzled because I was on various things. I sit on the board of the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, which is an extraordinary organisation that gives away about 40 or 50 million pounds a year to really good causes, not just on the environment. And I chair Plant Life, and I do a whole range of other things. It's just because it's really interesting, and you meet fantastic people who are committed. But I was actually doing too much travelling, I think is fair to say. And I'm based up in the Yorkshire Dales, so it's quite a haul to get to London. I was down in London a lot. So when COVID came along, yes, we were all terrified by what that meant for working practices and the economy. But I tell you two things I did do that came out of that has changed me. One is, like many people, I've discovered Zoom and Teams. And so my carbon footprint has been completely decimated because of the ability to attend 5 meetings rather than 1 in a day, and not have to travel and burn carbon. So it's been amazing. And the other thing is, I've got much fitter because I'm spending a lot more time cycling around, terrifying the other users of the roads in the Yorkshire Dales on my bike. And so I bought a big, massive mountain bike with a large battery on it, and I go flying around the country lanes on that, and not necessarily that safely, but that's helped me keep pretty fit on it, probably fitter than I feel that have felt for quite a few years. And so, so it's cutting carbon has been really good, and I am maintaining that now. So the way the Environment Bank operates is that we have our 41 staff are virtually, we work virtually, but they're based across the whole of the UK, and we have one hub office at the University of York's science campus, which is fantastic. But we don't do the travelling backwards and forwards to offices as we probably would have done pre-COVID. So it's made a big difference to our the way we operate and the way we think, and it's better for ourselves. You've just got to make sure that you account for your time and you are accountable, and you don't skive off. But I think that in the industry we're in, people are in it for the love as well as the fact that it's a really great profession. So I think that stimulates people to even work harder and better, I think, and not having to be stressed by being on public transport all the time.
Yes, that's definitely something that me and the SocEnv team have talked about. All the same trends, cutting carbon, and even being more productive sometimes. So yeah, that's great to hear. And so now, kind of looking forwards, how can different sectors work together to reach net zero? Do you have any examples of organisations collaborating effectively to reduce emissions?
Oh, to reduce emissions. So that's sort of, I suppose, it's slightly towards the edge of my knowledge, although I do know that certainly, let's take the NGO sector. So the NGO sector are doing a lot of work, obviously, in this area on the sort of 30 by 30 challenge, which has net zero as one of the objectives, I think, within how these organisations operate. And I'm starting to see, thankfully, a glimmer of hope that the NGOs are going to work more closely together. And I think there is a bit of a, if I dare say, a logos, silos, an egos mentality that we have in the NGO sector. I don't think we have it in the private sector in the same way. And it's critical that we do get away from that, and that the organisations work closely together and don't double up and don't sort of have overemphasize all the sort of things that they might do. So, the sort of back office functions are the ways that they could work together more closely. And certainly we've challenged Plant Life to think about that. How do we work more closely and better aligned with organizations so that we're not replicating effort? And I think ultimately that will have an overarching impact on reaching net zero targets. So that's from the NGO sector. I'm starting to see some real glimmers of hope there, but there's still a long way to go. In the private sector, there are certainly those sectors where there are serious emissions issues. I think they are really starting to tackle those. And it's one thing that we're launching a new product soon, which will enable corporates to invest in our habitat banks to reduce their impacts on biodiversity and on natural capital and, of course, on carbon. And I think that I can see that certain sectors are going to be better at doing their net zero than others. And I'm already starting to see real interest in corporates wanting to reduce their footprint and then offsetting the residual impacts that they can't reduce to zero, not just in carbon, but in other asset classes. And they're coming to us to say, can you help us with doing this to become nature positive? And go back to the 55% global GDP relies on what nature provides. Those corporates have got to do that, because the ones that don't address these issues will be laggards and will fall behind and will fail ultimately. The corporates that embrace their impacts and do something about natural capital now will be the ones that will survive. So it's like an evolutionary race, I think the corporates are into. And so I can't give you any of the specific examples, although I do think that I think potentially at the moment the private sector is addressing the issues more critically than perhaps the NGO sector. The NGO sector is coming up with the advocacy requirements. How are we going to advocate for better net zero positions? Whereas I think the private sector really are having to get on with it. And the reason why is because the investors are going to be very choosy about who they invest in the future. So it makes great business sense for corporates to look at their emissions, look at their impacts on natural capital and do something about it. Otherwise, they won't be able to get the investment that they will need to enable them to grow.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear about how sustainability and commercial factors are intertwined. So how can leaders such as yourself influence other industry leaders who don't currently have your level of environmental expertise to make substantial changes to protect the environment?
Crikey, that always assumes that I'm a leader. I'm never sure whether that's quite true.
Well, you are. You're on the ENDS power list. You're officially a leader.
Well, if we take that as a possible fact, but could be challenged, I'm sure, by many. I think that I think it's about generating ideas. Actually, I think that people like me, I mean, I may not necessarily be a phenomenal detail person, although I do get a bit frustrated when I see things written that, you know, where it's not particularly well spelled out what people are trying to achieve. But I've been given time to think, I think, and one of the if I don't like perhaps giving people advice, but if I were to give people advice, it's try and set some time aside in your day to day to think about ideas. And one thing I think I've done as I've got older is I've read a lot more about the historical position. You know, what was history like? What does history tell us? And if you are leading in your field, I think you can look back at how issues and problems were faced and solved in the past, and that can help you to look at how you plan things for the future. And we often tend to forget the past. We think, oh, it's in the past, it's not really that relevant, you know, it's all fine, interesting stuff, but we can learn a lot. I'll just give you one example. I was on a call a few weeks ago, and someone very senior as a policy advocate said that they'd had a really good idea about how to reduce artificial nitrate fertilizer on crops. And it was to do with planting or undersowing, effectively they meant planting, in cereal fields, species of leguminous plants, so clover and those sorts of things. And they said if you did that, that would then sequester nitrogen into put nitrogen into the soils, which would then mean you wouldn't need to use artificial fertilizer. And everyone said, oh, that's a really good idea. And I just pointed out that we actually thought about that in the 12th century, I think it was. And it was called, say, like the Norfolk Forecourse, and it's undersowing with clover to generate nitrates in the soil. And it's quite extraordinary that, you know, it's easy to forget things or not learn things in the future. You know, so I think one of the things is that look at history and read history and look at how things were back in the day, because many of our ancestors had some great ideas and solutions, and also created some nightmares. There's no doubt about that. But I think give yourself time to think, and just sit and think about what are problems, what are they coming up with. And I did one thing recently, 2 or 3 years ago, which was looking at how agricultural innovation could be used to help with environmental outcomes. And so it was, you know, so we looked at a whole range of things, and it was fascinating to see how innovation, you know, brainstorm or horizon scan what innovations are likely to come along, to have no boundaries to the way you think, and look at what might happen. So obviously GPS, robotics, gene editing, gene silencing, all of those sorts of things, and how will they influence how we use land. And it's just I just enjoy that sort of mental acrobatics, maybe, and it give yourself time to think, I think is one thing I would say to people. It's a really good, because we spend so much time rushing around from one meeting to the next. Yeah, the second thing is I'd probably say in terms of leading is make sure that the meetings you go to are worth going to. A lot of people perhaps go to meetings because they think they should be there and be seen to be there, but that's not really a good reason to go. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I suppose you maybe have already covered this, but more specifically, if you could give advice to yourself at 18, what would it be?
Oh, at the age of 18. Crikey, yeah, this is a great question. Quite difficult, that. What would I say? I suppose probably don't necessarily be too eager to progress. Take a bit of time, a time to plan, and I think long and hard about your career moves. That's what I would probably have done back in those days, because it's quite easy to take a job on that. You know, if you don't enjoy a job, it doesn't seem to me that it's a really good job to be doing. So But of course, we're all eager at the time, aren't we, at 18 to get on and progress ourselves. Oh yeah, and definitely the other thing is, I don't know why, because I mean, my children, you see it in them where they always think that the sort of the grown-ups, if you like, I know 18 is supposed to be grown up, but we're not. The grown-ups don't know anything, and you always know best. Probably step back from that a bit and try and learn a bit more from parents and mentors, because you don't know everything. And I know when I was 18, I probably thought I knew everything, and I didn't know anything at all, really. So yeah, a good lesson is to listen to people. That's probably the thing I would say is listen, perhaps a lot more than speak, because it's really useful, and we still should do that now, definitely.
Thank you. That's really great advice. And finally, what's next for you? Do you have anything exciting coming up?
Well, I think the getting into the corporate sector, so and explaining to all these important corporates that do generate the wealth creation and the jobs for people, explaining to them the criticality of biodiversity loss. That is, for me, the ultimate thing to be doing next. In whatever way I can, I'll never be the sort of communicator that David Attenborough is. I suspect almost no one will be, actually, but I just really want to be able to explain to people in as easy a way as possible that we have really got to address this issue now. There's no point. We cannot wait any longer. And we need to restore our landscapes and our natural capital. So for me, the next big thing is going to be looking at how to engage the corporate sector and bring them into the sort of mindset that I'm in now, to show how they can not see the environment as a burden, but as an opportunity. Because, without our environment, we haven't got anything really. And I know, for example, at the moment, it seems difficult to explain when you've got a really tough way forward for the next couple of years on cost of living. There's no doubt about that. It's going to be very tough for people. But we absolutely cannot renege on the nature commitments, because the environment that we will then get will be the environment we deserve, and that will be pretty catastrophic for far more people. Effectively, the cost of living, awful though it is to say, is a relatively insignificant blip. And it is awful to say that, but it is, compared to getting it wrong over climate, getting it wrong over biodiversity. So I really want to dedicate the next few years I've got to trying to get that message across, but not just telling people about it, coming up with solutions as to what people might do. And that's all around, as I say, getting them to invest in nature-based solutions and turning the tide away from exploitation of nature and natural capital into protection and enhancement and restoration. And then I think we've got a chance.
Thank you so much for that. That was a great answer. So that brings us to a close then. So thank you so much, David, for answering our questions and for giving up your time for this interview. Thank you to all those who are watching. You may be interested in checking out other videos in this interview series. You can watch them all via our SocEnv YouTube channel. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about SocEnv and what we do, please visit our website, socenv.org.uk. Thank you so much for watching.